So, Julius, thank you so much for joining in this conversation today. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Gaurav. Of course, I guess like many of you in India, I'm self-isolating. But for an introvert like me, of course, this is a pleasure. I can write, I can reflect on life, and I can start to think about how I might live my life different when we come through this pandemic.
I'm sure. I personally believe it's a time to relook and redefine your life because business is not going to be the same. Market is going to take a different turn altogether. Industry is going to take a very different stand. Things might not support you in whatever you were doing, or your clients or your customers might turn a blind look towards you. So either you can stop or you can take a stand and start everything from scratch if the need be. So, and it's a good time to reflect and find meaning in whatever you're doing. And it's a good conversation that I'm going to have with you because every time I've had a conversation with you in the past as well, it has left me with some really beautiful jewels to ponder on. So thank you so much for accepting my invitation to be on this podcast.
Thank you, Gaurav. It's my pleasure too.
I remember when you handed over your book to me, Uncommon Sense and Common Nonsense. And I understand you wrote this book 5 years back.
Yes.
I'm very intrigued. What made you choose this topic and write about this?
Well, I've always been interested as a professor of business at London Business School and more recently at INSEAD as to why some organizations, some companies outperform others over extended periods of time. And I came to the view that winning companies know something and learn faster than losing companies. And that part of the activity, what we call learning, is about discovering new things, discovering new forms of behavior, discovering new truths. And I call these new truths uncommon sense. Sense because they're true, uncommon because we're unique in knowing these truths. So that was the object of the exercise, to write about competitive strategy as a kind of learningful strategy.
So beautiful. Finding your own truth that might help you
Yes.
to move to the next level of effectiveness, in the next level of showing up as an individual. And you've also written
Exactly.
another book called Being a Better Leader.
Yes.
Tell me more about that as well.
This took a more philosophical stance. I wanted to ask the question, what do the great philosophers say that could be useful about the design of the workplace? How can we humanize the workplace so that we're more effective? And of course, the great philosophers typically are not used in business schools to make sense of the times we're living in, particularly the time that we spend at work. So I wanted to draw from the great philosophers some of the lessons that they bring to the art of management, to the art of leadership, to the art of relating to others in the workplace.
Yeah. So I understand that both the books are somewhere related to and connected to the workplaces. What makes one workplace more effective than the other one? What is it that's there in the culture that helps people to perform at the best of their own performance?
Yes, and I felt that the notion of ownership of ourselves, what might be called self-ownership, being most fully oneself, is where everything starts. If we're more effective, those around us will become more effective. So I wanted to ask really what the key ingredients of this notion of self-ownership might be, and try and unpack these notions so that they're more practical, more
I'm sure.
useful in the
Yeah.
day-to-day living that we experience in the workplace.
Yeah. So, Julius, you've used the word self-ownership. And, in fact, this podcast is around ownership. It's about, finding moments in your life where you can meaning as well. And who else could better define ownership from somebody who has been in the space of academics for the longest period of time, who has been working with different organizations, who has written 2 books as well. So how do you define self-ownership?
I think there are 3 parts to that question, Gaurav. I think the first is might be called identity. How do we decide? How do we define ourselves? What sets us apart? What makes us the person we are? That's what I call, if you like, identity or personhood. The second one is meaning. What meaning do we attach to life? What really matters to us? What drives us? How do we define success, achievement, goodness, purpose, and so on? And finally, the third dimension of ownership, particularly self-ownership, I think is agency, the recognition that we have choice and free will. And therefore those questions are, what's my part in the action? What difference can I make? And where do I fit in? So those are the three core notions: identity, meaning, and agency.
So it's going to be a beautiful triangle that we are going to jump into. In fact, while I'm talking to Julius, it reminds me of one of my friends and a teacher and a mentor. And you always ask me, Gaurav, what do you really care? What do you really care for? And I was involved in a conversation with somebody, and this gentleman has been a business leader for the longest period of time. And I was very curious to understand from him because he's very well known in the Indian HR fraternity. You'll find his articles on the front page of most of the newspapers in India. And I was very curious to understand from him. And I asked this gentleman, he's like 64 today. I asked this gentleman, I said, help me understand, Mr. So and so. I said, what do you think? What is the deepest understanding that I need to have to perform the way you perform? Because people love you, people respect you for everything that you do, and people find themselves connected with you. So he said in a beautiful, polite manner. And just imagine, right? He's 64, gray hair, he has got gray beard, and he has got some beautiful care and softness in his eyes. And in his baritone, he said, Gaurav, it's very important to find an answer to a question. That what is your message to the world? And everything and anything that you're doing, if you can connect that with the answer to the question, what's your message to the world, you'll be doing something really meaningful. And as I'm listening to you, Julius, it reminds me of that conversation. In fact, in some form or the other, I get many such inspiring messages during every coaching conversation that I'm involved into, especially those conversations that I indulge into during Coaching Matters. For our listeners who are hearing this for the first time, Coaching Matters is a complimentary bi-weekly webinar series for all those who are in some way or the other involved in coaching and want to grow. So let's get into these 3 points one by one. And I would love to understand from your perspective the way you define identity. What do you think? What is identity for you?
Yes, I'm very moved by the story you've just told. Finding answers to the great questions. I guess the other aspect of that is, what are the big questions? Often it takes as much skill to come up with the questions that really matter as the answers that provide, if you like, satisfactory solutions to those questions. So that's what struck me about the story you've just told. So yes, in relation to identity and the question of how each of us defines ourselves, I think that in some sense there is a passive and an active way of doing this. I think the passive way is to accept the labels that other people might place on us. And these will be more stereotypical labels that were none of our choosing, but they could be used as a classification for the person we are. And this might be around gender or nationality or race. So I would be thought of perhaps as a male, Caucasian Englishman. But of course, it's a very passive way of thinking about my identity.
So it's something that you're born in.
Yes, something that you're born in rather than something that you choose for yourself through your own agency.
Okay, just tell me more about the second one when you're saying that that's something that you choose to be.
Yes, I call that the active voice or the active identity. And of course, there's a very famous example here. T.S. Eliot, the great American English poet of 20th century, at some point in his career, he defined himself as a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and an Anglo-Catholic in religion. And this is coming closer to, if you like, a much more active voice definition of who one is. And of course, we have fantastic options available to us in terms of the person we see ourselves as and the person that we choose to become.
Beautiful. And, and what I'm listening right now, it's not about connecting yourself and saying that I'm a teacher, or I'm a professional drummer, or I'm a professional guitarist, or I'm a vocalist, I'm a football player. It's not like that, right?
That might be part of it. The profession we choose to be, the skill we choose to exercise, is part of an active voice definition of our identity. But sometimes it goes a bit deeper into the values we espouse and the moral precepts we try to live up to, and the kind of relationship that we should have with others. And I think it's in those dimensions that we find our true sense of self.
And I've also heard about something called identity trap. Would you have any idea about that?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yes, an identity trap. In a sense where we get stuck either with a label that we place on ourselves or with a label that other people have placed on us. I like the notion that's becoming very popular in business schools at the moment between the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And the fixed mindset would be one where we're trapped in our identity. We're unable to flex our identity, to try different ways of being, and feel, if you like, entrapped in some earlier definition of ourselves. Whereas a growth mindset is allowing us to be open to other options, to keep exploring the person we could be.
Yeah.
Because you see, Gaurav, what I really want to say here is that the Socratic notion of the person, Socrates, of course, the great Greek philosopher, was that in effect, life is a form of self-expression. We're born as a certain kind of person with a certain kind of identity. And as we live, so we give expression to the true person within. But Aristotle believed that that was profoundly mistaken. He thought, in a sense, we were a blank canvas, and that we could paint onto that canvas a much more creative idea of the person that we want to be or should be. And therefore, he claimed that we act our way into the person we choose to become. And by pretending to be someone, we become that person if we enact that idea of that person conscientiously enough. So it's open to us how we explore and execute some notion of our selfhood.
Beautiful. And the point is, how can we bring these two together? One is knowing yourself and being yourself. This is who you are. I personally tell people that very important pillars of leadership in an individual is self-awareness and self-acceptance. At the same time, choosing to become who you believe you can become. And that's where the notion of identity, the notion of, belief come together. And then you show up in the world the way you would like to show up. And then you make a declaration in the world that this is who I am.
Very beautifully expressed. I wish I could have put it as well as that. That's exactly it. We do, of course, have a genetic inheritance. A large part of our behavior, a large part of our selfhood, of course, we inherited from our parents and from our ancestors. But there's still an area of openness for exploration and for self-definition. And sometimes the modern world gives us the impression that there's not much scope there for self-expression. And what I want to suggest is that that is a space in which the meaning that we attach to life can be explored and given full expression.
Beautiful. And this is where we bring in the concept of nature and nurture together.
Yes.
As I'm talking to you, this reminds me of something that Theodore Roosevelt said once. He said, "I choose not to be a common man. Me, it's my right to be uncommon if I can. I will never cower before any master, nor bend to any friend. It is my heritage to stand straight and bold and face the world boldly and say, this I have done."
I love that. I hadn't come across that. He was a wonderful man. He was very much an exemplar of someone who had, quite early in life, a notion of the person he could become. And he worked conscientiously towards that notion. Of course, it's beautifully expressed in the word you quote.
And when we do something from a space of being or from a space of becoming, I think then everything is possible.
Yes.
Thank you, Julius, for bringing all these thoughts together in this conversation. I just love talking to you.
Thank you.
Julius, there are a lot of people that I come across who are working in big organizations, right? And I'm sure you come across a lot of people who would want to start their second career, who would like to start their second journey, and they take a halt and just go for higher education with London Business School, or for that matter with INSEAD that you're currently teaching in. And you also spoke about the meaning part, the moral compass part. Now, I'm just curious to understand from you, is there any way that could help people to find meaning?
Gosh, that's such a big question, isn't it? In a way, I think we bump into the greatest opportunities, or at least we turn what might seem mundane into something that's significant. We notice something in the environment, we see an opportunity, we're surprised by something that happens, and we give ourselves the right to use that as a platform for exploration. I'm very taken by the evolutionary paradigm that everything works to the process of variation and selection. We try things out. Some things work, some things don't. We surrender those that don't, and we stay closer to those that do work. And in some sense, the variation side of the equation is blind. We don't know what's going to happen if we try things out. We're not brilliant forecasters. We find the future very difficult to predict. But the brave person, the one that keeps trying out fresh options, different ways of solving the standard questions, is more likely to bump into the truth than someone who's fearful of experimentation. So in some sense, your question about meaning is simply giving ourselves permission to be more experimental. And I think often in the workplace, in a large corporation, it's quite difficult to take these kinds of risks. We can see the downside of making mistakes very, very clearly, and seeing the upside of the occasional success much less clearly. And yet business should be an exploratory activity where we give ourselves rights to exercise experimentation and trial and error. So I think it's very much in that way of being brave in the face of risk that we explore and discover meaning, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, but the question is, how willing am I to take risk during the turbulent times? In fact,
yes,
3 days back, I was reading an article and that says that 10 successful startups founded during the recession of 2008, which are doing really well today. And the names were like Dropbox, the names were like Slack, Square, Instagram, Pinterest, Uber, Groupon. So these are the organizations which started during the recession period of 2008 and 2009. In fact, I started my company in the same period when things were going really haywire. People said that you should not jump into something. It's a white water turbulent time going on. And the question is, am I willing to take that risk? Am I willing to pose that faith in the universe and then do it anyways?
It reminds me of a book I recently, which I found very, very interesting, by Bronnie Ware. Bronnie Ware is a palliative nurse in the National Health System in England. And she was concerned with what she called the regrets of the dying. These are the regrets we have at the end of our life as to how we wished we lived our life rather differently. And believe it or not, the most important regret in life, and I'm quoting her words now, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life that others expected of me. And I think that notion of giving oneself permission, encouraging oneself to take risks, is part and parcel of the answer of being truly human. We only have this one life. We pass this way once. I realize that there are alternative religious views on this, but if we assume that this life is very precious and that time is passing quickly, we need to pack in more experience, not less, and that'll only come from courage. I think Aristotle defined courage as the most important virtue because all others flow from it.
Yeah, so true. As I'm just talking to you, it reminds me 3 years back, I was in Rome. We were out for dinner, and there's this gentleman. He was there in the same restaurant where we were at. The family was they were celebrating his 87th birthday, and they were really happy. They were celebrating, and I was very curious because it's like a 87-year-old gentleman. If I remember it correctly, his name was Eddie, and
Eddie.
yeah, he was celebrating his birthday. I went to him. I wished him, "Sir, wish you a very happy birthday." And he was very happy. So we got into this conversation. And I said, "Sir, if you were to share with me one life lesson, what would that be?" And he said, "Live your life every moment.
Yes,
Make a sincere attempt to find meaning in everything that you're doing.
yes,
Because apart from finding meaning in everything that you do, there's no other meaning to life."
yes.
And I was like pleasantly surprised. Apart from
Mm,
finding meaning in everything that you're doing currently, there's no other meaning in life. And
yes.
especially the kind of times that we all are into, I'm just wondering, is there anything that really matters? Do all my accomplishments, they have any meaning? And does the car that I drive, does it make any sense to me? The credentials that I have, does it make any sense at all? And that's a
Mm.
reflective zone that we all are into these days.
Yes, of course, in some sense, we're born with will, with a strength of will. We want life to mean something, even if in some philosophical sense there's no prescribed meaning. We make meaning where we find it. That's the joy of being human, that we can attach
Yes.
different kinds of meaning to life and so on. And the importance of gratitude and counting our blessings and so on. But I guess most of us, certainly in my case, I've underused the options, the privileges I've had in life. One of my regrets would be I wished I'd been more courageous. I wished I'd tried out more things. I wished I'd given myself permission to be, feel like, released from what others might think, and to be, if you like, more conscientious in the experiments that I ran. It's very easy, isn't it, to play too safe and perhaps
Mm.
postpone courage for another day. But as you say from the story of Eddie, um, every moment can be well used. And the moments we have right at the moment with the pandemic are moments to precisely ask these kinds of questions and to reflect quietly on what our answers might be.
Yeah, I personally believe that we are right now in the going scenario, we are once again back to the first level of the Maslow's hierarchy, where we are talking about the basic safety, forget about self-actualization. We are talking about finding meaning in our own houses. When we all are isolated, we have somebody to talk to is our family members and friends, and that's it.
Yes.
So, Julius, you spoke about three things, right? The first thing that you spoke about was identity. The second
Yes.
one was meaning. The third, you spoke about agency. Tell me more about that. What does that mean? So, you spoke about where can I make a difference?
Yes, how can I make a difference? Where do I fit in? What's my role? What role do I give myself? Not just at work, although that's obviously very important, but in the family, in living generally. Um, and here I think, again, it reflects back on our earlier conversation, quite important to recognize that we have choice, that there is such a thing as freedom of will. We're not simply matter that is determined by causal chains. We have choices. We can provide reasons for what we do. We don't have to be subject to the causes of what we do. And I like the phrase that Aldous Huxley used in relation to agency. He said, experience is not what happens to a person, but what they do with what happens to them. In other words, there is a gap between our experience, for example, our upbringing, uh, the events that happen in our lives, and what we make of these things and how we use them to shape our own sense of purpose and meaning and agency. I've been reading recently a very interesting book by Robert Plomin, the geneticist, on what makes us the person we are. And of course, in biology nowadays, there's a very strong deterministic tradition that suggests, if we go back to nature and nurture, that we're largely a product of nature and that nurture doesn't make any difference. It's something like 60-40, 60% our DNA, 40% the environment. But in the environment, Plomin
Hmm.
was pointing out, there are very few laws of cause and effect. In other words, scientists have been unable to find direct relationships between styles of parenting and the outcome of having parents such as the ones we had. And he gives a very interesting example of how the environment influences us. He goes back to Bill Clinton, the US president, of course, who, when he was quite young, growing up in Arkansas, the school made a visit to Washington, and he made a visit to the White House as this teenager. And he found that he was shaking hands with JFK, with John Kennedy. And as he was shaking Kennedy's hand, he thought, one day, I want to be the president of the United States. And
Wow.
Plomin used this example as a way in which we can turn an event in our life into more than an event. It can shape our options, our future, our desires. And therefore, this is a lovely example of agency. This is a fact. We shake a hand of somebody, but the interpretation that we place on that fact can completely reshape our lives. And therefore, in some sense, agency is the recognition that from moment to moment, we can reinterpret the world, see events, turn them into happenings, and allow those happenings to shape our sense of who we can be and what we do.
Beautiful. And in fact, you know what? I often tell people that you come across moments in your life, and the moment you're willing to seize that moment, you can actually create a different future for yourself. And these
Yes,
moments, they happen to us on day-to-day basis, right? And then
yes.
there are people who seize that moment and then create something meaningful out of them, out of their life, right? Now, I'm just curious to understand, and this is especially for people who are doing a 9 to 5 job, who might be struggling to find something really meaningful. So, no, let's say if you are delivering a lecture, what are the questions that you're going to ask them that might help them to find something really meaningful in their life? And how can they actually change the course of their career and their life?
Yes, what a good question. I think one starting point, and I certainly find this with executives in mid-career, let's say in their early to mid-40s, these are existential moments in people's life where they start to ask much deeper questions of themselves. The question there might be, where am I stuck? And try and unpick that sense of being stuck. Because I think that if we were to clarify the impediment, what's holding us back, the barrier, almost certainly only in our own mind, then, if you like, those questions will certainly enable us to come up with answers that are quite radical for ourselves in terms of our choices in the future. It may be, for example, that our work is no longer satisfying. It may be that those we're working with are no longer inspiring. It may be that our boss is a particularly difficult person to work with and for. It may be that the conversations we have at work are insufficiently inspiring. And of course, it may be that we've tried to resolve these issues over 2 or 3 years and are failing to do so. Confronting those questions, possibly in conversations with one's family, in confronting those questions, I think we're much more likely to make the jump we need to make and give ourselves the right to try something completely different. Some of the most interesting lives that I've experienced in those of my friends and those I come across teaching are lives that take different directions at different moments. It's not a single line. Certainly for those in their early 20s, life is not seen as a single line, nor will it take the form of a single line. It will be many starts and many finishes. And these lives of far greater variety, I think, will be far more fulfilling.
So it begins with asking yourself this question, where am I stuck? What's holding me back? And then you said something really beautifully, confront yourself at times. It's very important to confront yourself. And I personally believe the moment I start asking myself these questions, what's holding me back, it will definitely help me to identify the patterns which might not be supporting me to take that leap, right?
Yeah.
As you mentioned, it's more intrinsic than extrinsic.
Yes.
And then give yourself a right, and I would say permission, to just take the next possible best step.
Yes, I tell you what, something I came across recently that really intrigued me. More good ideas come from those who smoke than those who don't smoke. This is in the workplace. And of course, on a moment's reflection, we realize why that might be. Smokers stand outside the building in the fresh air at different points in the day with others drawn from different parts of the organization, and where the conversation turns to those things that are on people's mind. And it's out of those natural conversations with people not necessarily from the same unit as you across the organization where really good conversations take place and where ideas, fresh ideas, are instilled. Not enough of the workplace takes the form of conversation where that sense of being stuck or the sense of frustration or a longing for something else that's never talked about, perhaps those conversations need to take place in the workplace where we can address, our fears and hopes. It's always in emotion that we find new intellectual thoughts. Everything begins and ends with emotion. And therefore find the space at work, the place at work, the natural place at work where emotions can find expression. Do you think that's a thought that's helpful?
Oh, absolutely. I just loved it when you said it's always in emotions that we find something meaningful. So thank you so much for sharing this. And what I've heard is that even when I'm stuck in my life, even when I know that there's something that's holding me, I just need to go out with a group of friends under one of the trees in the open space, in the fresh air, have a conversation with them. And during that conversation, I'm sure new ideas would pop out, and then I'll be able to do something really meaningful. And it's all about trusting that something might emerge for me, provided I'm willing to confront myself, provided I'm willing to get into the deeper conversation with myself.
Yes, you put it brilliantly.
Thank you so much, Jules. It was wonderful talking to you as always, and I'm sure our audience going to love it. Jules, if
Thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you. And I strongly recommend one of the books that I've read. It says Uncommon Sense and Common Nonsense. And I can't wait to read the second book as well, Being a Better Leader. Jules, thank you so much. I wish you all the very best. Stay home, stay safe. God bless.
Thank you, Gaurav. Likewise. Bye-bye to you all.